Okay, welcome to Advanced Ebook QA with Accessibility in Mind. And this is a really topical workshop because there's a lot of backlist conversion work happening and backlist polishing up happening in Canada right now. And this is exactly the right time to dig a little deeper on how to do that QA to make sure that your books are hitting the marks. So without further ado, let's dig in. So today I'm going to work mostly from the APLN checklists for ebook QA. So APLN, if you're not aware, it's the Accessible Publishing Learning Network. It's a site that was launched a year ago, September. It's a project that came from eBound Canada and had a lot of work on that site done by NNELS, the National Network for Equitable Library Services. It's an exceptionally good site, and I don't just say that because I had a little bit of a hand in pulling it together, but it's really well thought through. There's lots of content on there for almost everything you need to ask a question about, and I'm going to talk more about it as we progress through this webinar. But that's the link on the screen right now, apln.ca / quality assurance of completed books / and when you get there, there's a downloadable checklist. You can have a PDF checklist on your site or on your desktop that you can then manipulate to meet your own needs and the needs of your content. So that said, if you have questions as we go along, please feel free to pop them in the chat. I know that you're not all in my head, and so you don't know what I know, and maybe I'm not explaining myself well enough. Some of this is really technical, and so I welcome questions. I welcome interruptions to explain something a little bit better as I move along. And then this session, just to warn you, will include some references to code and will show code samples. Brace yourself as is necessary. All of my screenshots are from Oxygen, which is an XML editor, and that's my ebook editor of choice. I know a lot of people use Sigil, which I hope will look quite familiar. Okay, first off, a quick note. There is no such thing as perfectly accessible, and working in accessibility is a bad place for perfectionists. The umbrella term disability is broad and covers a myriad different situational and permanent conditions. What is accessible to someone with low vision might be overwhelming to a person with a learning disability. I would also suggest that it's easy to get snagged on what looks like an error to you, say how VoiceOver reads a phrase, for example, but a blind person might tell you that it's no difference, that it's no biggie. So the key thing to consider here is this. Look at the details, but also consider the entire user experience. So narrow in on the details, but also go broad and think about the whole thing. Good accessibility is about compliance, so meeting standards or getting certified, but great accessibility is about empathy. And a giant chunk of that empathy that I want you to bring to thinking about the reading experience is rolling people with the lived experience of a disability into the testing and QA process. And in this regard, NNELS is an excellent collaborator. They're deeply invested in accessible outcomes for Canadian books, so put them to work. All right, let's dig in. Here's your first code sample. Hopefully no one fled screaming. So step one, what flavor of EPUB is your book? Is it EPUB 2 or EPUB 3? InDesign, which is a very popular tool to create ebooks, mostly because almost all print books are made from InDesign, not all, but most. InDesign no longer defaults to EPUB 2, which is helpful. It defaults to EPUB 3. You have to go in and choose EPUB 2 if you'd rather have it export to that flavor of code. But let's say you're focused on a backlist remediation project and you need to make sure, then this is the place to see it. It can be tricky to figure out which format it is. Sometimes the reading system will give you clues, but the best way to see if an EPUB is EPUB 3 is to peek into the OPF file of an ebook. And it'll be right there on that second line of the OPF file to say version 2.0 or 3.0. And then just to be clear, publishers, I mean, everyone on this call should always opt for EPUB 3. There's no reason at this point in time to choose EPUB 2. It used to be that there was a rogue vendor who refused to update their systems, but that shouldn't be the case anymore. And if you know of any, send me their email. I just want to talk. I promise, just to talk. EPUB 3 is designed to be accessible and is akin to opting for something three-dimensional over something flat. And I'm also not going to go into this in detail, but you should check that your book is reflowable. If it's not a children's picture book, manga, or a comic book, it has no business being fixed layout. So fixed layout is a sort of different ball of wax and is a little bit out of scope for this session. But if you have more questions about that, my email will be at on the last slide, and you're welcome to email me and ask me more about it. Okay, CSS. This is a really important piece of the ebook puzzle and can impact the accessibility experience fairly profoundly. Cleaning up CSS, particularly that exported from InDesign, is very nearly like cleaning a toilet or doing the dishes. No one wants to do it, but it must be done. There are basic things that InDesign exports that will absolutely get in the way of a print-disabled reading experience. Setting the font color as black might cause your text not to inverse when a user switches to night mode, for example. A base body font size, if it is in M's, a base body font size, even if it is in M's, could interfere with changing the size type, something that is critical for low vision readers. Some of the other changes I've made in this example on the screen are not salient to the accessibility case, except that it's simpler is always more elegant. So in this example, I've taken 21 lines of CSS and compressed it down to 9. And this is for the base body style. Other styles can be even further compressed because they cascade from this style. If you're QAing a book with unremediated InDesign CSS vomit, like what you see here on the left, then that is definitely a red flag about your vendor. When considering accessibility, the most important thing about CSS is that it is doing the stylistic heavy lifting. There should be absolutely no inline styling, none, zero zip zilch. It might feel easy to do this, to use inline styling because it's a nice quick fix, but it will absolutely get in the way of the responsiveness of your content. So 42 pixels is 42 pixels on a phone, 42 pixels on a tablet, and 42 pixels on a desktop. That dimension is static and will not expand and contract with the screen size. Additionally, a low vision user who needs to make the text bigger will experience poor readability on that sentence styled at 1.2 M that does not get larger with the rest of the text. It might work as expected in some reading systems, but it will not work in all of them. So what does it look like and how do I find it? So this is on your screen are 3 examples of inline styling. So inline styling to increase the font size in the first instance, inline styling to define the width of an image in the second instance, and inline styling to give a left margin in the third instance. So ACE will point to any inline styling and suggest it is an error. We saw last week in the workshop with Saiba and Elizabeth how to use ACE. ACE by Daisy is an indispensable tool, and it will point out inline styling. So avoid it wherever possible. And if you see it in your book, that's another red flag about your vendor. I hate to break it to you. Now I want to talk about clean HTML. So one of the reasons that EPUB is made from HTML is that it's a relatively simple technology that's well aligned with web technologies and that HTML is natively accessible. So let the HTML do the heavy lifting for you. And this means that you're avoiding generic HTML like divs and spans as much as possible. Sometimes it's not always entirely possible to avoid them, but you avoid them as much as possible. While these tools may accomplish what you need them to, they are most often not the right tool for the job. Don't use a hammer when you mean to use a screwdriver. So span class equals italic, div class equals image, and p class equals h1, which is something I saw in the wild yesterday, so people are still doing that, are not machine readable HTML. Span class equals italic should just be an I tag. Div class equals image should be a figure tag. And p class equals h1 should be an h1 tag. So accessible HTML looks something like what you're seeing now on the screen. A div should be a section and a side, a figure, or a block quote. A span should be any one of those other tags that you see there. M, I, cite, B, strong, superscript, subscript, small, underline, or abbreviation. This this slide is HTML for ebooks. This is one I use in classes when I'm teaching ebooks to students. So this is almost all the HTML that you'll need to build your content. And you'll notice that div and span are nowhere on this list. So if you're using a div to set some content aside on a screen, that should be an aside. So like a sidebar. Sidebar should be an aside. Lists should be marked up as ordered or unordered lists, or they will get read as one long run-on sentence. I'm just fixing a typo. There we go. Images and captions should be in figure and fig caption tags, with the latter nested in the former after the IMG tag. So figure, IMG tag, fig caption, and then close fig caption tag, close figure tag. Editorial breaks or context breaks with or without a dingbat should be inside of an HR tag, and the dingbat should come from the CSS. Block quotes should be paragraphs inside of a block quote tag. So take a screenshot of this. If this feels new to you, take a screenshot of it and come back to it over and over again. Although I will, of course, make the slides available to you later. Yes, a recording will be made available afterwards, Stephanie. So avoid span and strong, and if you're finding, or span and divs, and if you're finding them in your content, look at this list and see what it actually should be. There's almost never should it be a div or a span. So clean HTML is really critical to accessibility. It might work, it might look as expected, but underneath the hood, or when someone's reading it in a non-traditional manner, i.e. with assistive technology, using the correct tool for the job will mean that they have a better reading experience. Okay, InDesign weirdness. I'm going to talk about InDesign just a little bit because it's such a popular tool. As part of my work on the board of the Accessible Books Consortium, a small group has been advocating with Adobe for about 2 years now, asking them to update their EPUB export. We've cataloged 89 ways that they can correct the export and collated them into 33 GitHub issues. And there's a URL on the screen, github.com/ways to read /InDesign A11Y/issues. And you can see those issues there if you'd like. So the good news is that the InDesign engineers are working on it. The bad news is that they don't really understand EPUB all that well, and they are slow. And they've only finally started working on our issues because the Federation of European Publishers threatened to report them to the EU. Good times. So have a look at that GitHub if you like. You may recall last fall that there was an update to InDesign that completely borked how languages were declared. We asked them to move the language declaration from the body element up to the root HTML element. So from line 8 on that screenshot on your screen up to line 3. They failed to do that, and in addition, suddenly there were language declarations everywhere. Initially, there were language declarations on every element in every span, some of which were actually empty, creating an invalid EPUB out of the box. They released a patch pretty quickly, but still a problem. So developers everywhere had to build a few more steps into their post-export workflows to delete all of these rogue language declarations. And you may be familiar with the junk that you see on this slide. So the good news is that this is now fixed in the very latest update to InDesign 18.5, although I think I'm actually out of date. I think there's another patch that it's more advanced than 18.5 now. And there are a couple of other updates as well. The latest release now exports with the language tag in the correct place. Hallelujah. This is a victory, a minor one, but a victory nonetheless. That said, InDesign has now changed how it exports images for EPUB. I hope this will get fixed quickly, but for now, here's what's happening. If an image in InDesign has no alt text applied in object export options, it will come out in the HTML with role equals presentation, which you see here on line 16 of this screenshot. Role equals presentation is the way to use ARIA roles, or dpub ARIA, it's referred to in a couple of different ways, to mark an image as decorative, which essentially means that assistive technology will just skip it So this is a nice update, but not the implementation that the InDesign working group was asking for, the InDesign EPUB working group. We've asked them to go back and add a checkbox to specify that an image is presentation only and not to default to presentation only for anything that doesn't have alt text. In the meantime, please be aware of that problem and accommodate for it. If every image in an InDesign file has image descriptions, then you don't have a problem. If most of them have alt text applied, but the images that don't are decorative, then you're also golden. And then my notes here are a little bit out of date. I just heard this morning. So there was supposed to be a full suite of accessibility metadata options built into the EPUB export. And that was supposed to be coming in 19.1. And I heard this morning that it's going to be put off to 19.2. So be aware of that. It's coming soon, but not as soon as I'd hoped. Okay, enough about InDesign. Language declarations. Make sure that there's a primary language declaration on the root HTML element in every single HTML file, including the navigation document and the cover. These last two often get missed by most EPUB developers. So it's very common to have it on the root HTML element, which is lines 3 to 5 on that slide there. It's also extremely common to miss adding those in the navigation document and on the cover HTML. If your EPUB came from InDesign, you will have to add the language declaration and a CSS declaration to both the nav and the cover HTML. Be sure that the main language is declared in the OPF metadata as well. And unless it's a truly bilingual publication, language shifts do not need to be noted in the OPF, which a tool like InDesign will do by default. So if you have a snippet of Italian and French in your manuscript, but it's mostly English, InDesign will automatically add English, Italian, and French language declarations to the OPF. And you'll need to clean out the Italian and the French because those are just quick snippets of language, not a bilingual publication. So be aware of that. And then make sure that language shifts are appropriately marked up. So there's two snippets of code on the screen. One is marking a piece of content, merci beaucoup, as French, and it's in italics because it's a foreign language. The second sample is in a span tag because we're not italicizing that bit of text, so span is appropriate here. And then the one thing I want to note here is this. I know that there's a lot of content published in Canada with snippets of Indigenous languages, and that the text-to-speech support is not necessarily there. But I implore you to mark up those language shifts nonetheless. Plan for a future when support is robust. So just, mark up those language shifts appropriately. Okay, on to images. Sorry about that. Doing a QA sweep of images means looking at them, making sure they're becoming disconnected from their captions where relevant, and making sure that they have non-repetitive alt text. So how to write alt text is a bit out of scope for this webinar, but if you haven't already discovered this tip, Ace by Daisy is the best place to proof image descriptions. The last tab, so it's summary, violations, metadata, outlines, and then images. If you click on the images tab, has a list of the images, their accompanying alt text, any aria described by content, and captions, including their location. And then if you scroll along to the right, you will also see any aria role attached to that image. If you look closely at the screenshot on the slide, you will see a typo that I planted there. Yep, that's my story and I'm sticking to it. I did that on purpose to make sure you were all awake. I don't make typos, nope, nope, nope. Okay, now let's talk about navigation. Checking the navigation is an exercise that's not for the faint of heart. And here's where you'll find me doling out advice that you won't hear from me often. Use Adobe Digital Editions. It is the clearest place to see the full navigation. So the table of contents, the landmarks, and the page list. It's also possible to see this in Thorium. It's just a little bit more buried. And I often tell publishers, especially publishers who are newish or are feeling tentative or nervous, that Adobe Digital Editions might be a little bit easier to see the full navigation. So you can see here, there's the table of contents, then there's the page list, and then the landmarks. This isn't a real book. This is a book that I made for teaching purposes. So don't go trying to find it. It's just basically the Wikipedia article on Dolly Parton. So it's really clear in Adobe Digital Editions to see how full the landmarks are, to see the nested pieces of the contents via the roll downs, and to see the page list. A good navigation goes at least 2 levels deep and preferably further. Most reading systems won't show you anything deeper than 2 levels, i.e. H1 and H2, but your ebooks should go as far as H4. That information might be available to assistive technology and could be useful to those users. A caution about QAing the page list. Sometimes clicking on page numbers feels like it takes you to random places in the ebook. And what's happening here is that the ebook is rendered based on how big your screen is. And the start of that print page is on the screen somewhere. So exercise some caution and patience when testing the page list. And then I also want to show you this screenshot from Apple Books. So here you can see, this is just a spread from that same book. And there are page numbers. So the little page numbers in the margin, so the 8 and the 9, they're showing where page 8 and where page 9 starts. And you see the running footers along the bottom say that the page on the left has a little bit of page 7 and a little bit of page 8, and the page on the right has a little bit of page 8 and a little bit of page 9. So that's another place to sort of proof how your page list is working. And let's talk about page lists for a minute. If your accessible ebook doesn't have a print corollary page list, including a DC source in the metadata and the OPF, then I question the completeness of that particular ebook. A good accessible ebook must have a page list. So a page list is literally a print corollary listing of the pages in the document. So somebody clicks on page 22, it takes them to page 22. So people using the digital version of the book and the print version of the book can literally be on the same page. This is what it looks like from Adobe Digital Editions and what the code in the OPF should look like. So you see on this snippet of code from the content.opf on line 12 is the ebook ISBN. Line 13 is the source ISBN. So that's the ISBN of the print book. And then line 14 says that this is the source of pagination. So that second ISBN is the source of the print pagination. And this is what it should look like, and this is how it works. Yes, you're right, Bruce. Bruce is asking a question in the chat about meta properties page break source, and you're quite right. This is an older book, and it should be updated. Stephanie's asking if there's an efficient way to add a print page number list to an ebook after the fact. I have really bad news for you, Stephanie. I have yet to find one. In fact, I'm fixing up some backlist ebooks, and I'm doing it by hand, which is, tedious and painful. I'm really sorry. I haven't found one way. After the book is exported, it's really hard to find a way to automatically add page numbers. I'm really sorry. And this is what the page list, I know, crying emoji, I hear you. This is what the page list markup should look like. So be careful that you're using, so it has an EPUB type equals page break and then ARIA role of doc-page break, an ID number with an ID that aligns rigorously with the ID in the toc.xhtml or the navigation document. And then the ARIA label. And this is the ARIA label I want to talk about for just a second. It should have, so if you look closely at this text on the screen, you'll see that there's a word space inside of the quote marks, and there's a period after the page number. And that's so that in some iterations of assistive technology, when that page number gets read, it gets read with the appropriate pauses. So that's the correct way to mark up the page list, just FYI. Are there any other questions about anything up to this point? I might just pause for a second to make sure that we're all, that I haven't lost anybody if there's any questions. Okay. I want to go on to talk about some common ACE by Daisy errors. ARIA roles are a really tricky part of EPUB. I mean, honestly, I've tried to sort this out a million times, and I often end up more confused than when I started the research. Basically, if you use EPUB type that has a corollary ARIA role, you will get an ACE error if you don't attach it. And I'm sure you're all familiar with that particular ACE error. So this is a list of all of the kinds of dpub ARIA or ARIA roles. This is directly from the DAISY knowledge base. If you're not familiar with the DAISY knowledge base, then I encourage you to get familiar with it. It is the de facto authority on all things accessible EPUB. There's no question about that. And this is a full listing of everything that they encourage you to use in terms of ARIA roles or digital publishing ARIA. A quick note about ACE errors. The folks at DAISY are amazing. I don't know if there's anybody here, but I really have nothing terrible to say about the folks at DAISY. They are like completely extra, super generous, wonderful people. But I'm convinced that the people who maintain ACE couldn't speak plain language to save their lives. I mean, their jobs are writing specification, which requires really precise technical language. It's not their fault. Ditto for EPUB checker errors. I teach ebook production at Toronto Metropolitan University, and man, the looks on students' faces as they try to parse those errors, it takes them getting used to the various errors and what they mean. So try not to be off, but I totally understand that it can feel really overwhelming. I've been there, I promise. But you do get used to it. And if you're intimidated by the error message, for heaven's sake, don't click the for more information button because the text at those links is extra inscrutable. Excuse me. I mean, maybe you're a real tech head and you like reading specs. I would rather not, personally. So use the DAISY knowledge base, use it well, use it rigorously, but also be aware that it can be a little bit tricky to use. And the ACE errors are not always as straightforward as most of us would like them to be. I'm going to move on now to the next slide. Tables. Tables continue to be a really gnarly part of making ebooks. I hate them a lot, and I try to stick to fiction conversions. Mostly kidding. Some best practices around tables. Headers should be formatted as header rows. So what you'll see here on the screen is that there's from lines 47 to lines 53 in the screenshot is something that's nested in a T head row. I've seen a lot of tables in my life where the header has formatting that makes it look like a header, but it's not under the hood, it's not formatted as a header. It's missing the T head. You absolutely have to put the header in a header row. And that's because some assistive technology, so how assistive technology might read the table on the screen right now is it would read response, no, percentage 59.37, count 393. And then for the next row, it would read response, yes, percentage 40.63, count 269. And the reason assistive technology understands that is because the header row is formatted as a header row. Reading tables with assistive technology can be really hard, especially if it's a lot of data. And if the header is formatted correctly, then it makes it a little bit easier. So headers should be formatted as header rows, and you can do this in both Word and InDesign. So if you're a production manager or a managing editor, then you should be looking into how to do that in both of those pieces of software so that your workflow is sound. My next piece of advice is to be aware of the overburden code out of InDesign. It doesn't do tables well, and just be really careful of that. It creates a lot of extra classes on everything. In InDesign, in particular, use table and cell styles for better CSS control. Explaining how to use those is out of scope here, but there is a video on APLN about how to do this, so go search that up. Excuse me. And if it's a long and complicated table, then you consider using a long description to keep the data live. I try really hard not to advocate for putting a table as an image. Try with all your might to avoid it. but sometimes it's just not possible. And in that case, prepare an image and be sure to test it in night mode and then keep the data live in a long description. And this is, like genuinely, I'm saying this out loud, but it is a worst case scenario thing to do. You should keep your data live as much as possible. So a long description is a simple non-linear HTML file that you link to and link back to the same spot in the text. I've documented this on my blog for those who want to try it. So you can go to laurabrady.ca and go to the blog, and there's a blog post on long descriptions if you want a way to do it. Also, please remember that if you're using table architecture for layout reasons, to avoid any of the paraphernalia that would point to it containing data, like a header row. So Bruce is asking another question in the chat. Do you normally embed tables in figures? Yeah, I do actually. It's easier to control how they're laying out. It's not required, but it is something that I do. It helps keep the title with the table. And you'll notice on the screen that there's actually line 67 to 69. There is a fig caption associated with this and has a class of hidden. And that's because I'm putting some text in the fig caption that's only available to assistive technologies, which is another way to do it. Just be cautious with hidden. Um, hidden equals hidden is something that will get tripped up on Amazon. So if you're using a lot of hidden content in your ebooks, make sure you test with Kindle Previewer. I lost the name of that for a second. Run that book through Kindle Previewer and make sure you're not getting any errors because hidden often goes pear-shaped on Kindle and in Amazon. Next thing I want to talk about is emphasis. You may be familiar with these concepts. This may be kind of Mickey Mouse to you, but I find that this is one of the trickiest concepts for developers to get. Part of the reason for this is that emphasis should be marked by editorial staff, and it rarely is. Actually, I got one book conversion earlier this year that had both M and I correctly coded from the InDesign file. It was in the source file, and I honestly almost cried with joy. It is very rare that these are differentiated in the source files, and that's because it's very rare that a manuscript hits production with these differentiated. So it's often left to developers or to someone who's QAing content to make sure that this is right. So when I get a book to QA, this is often one of the first things that I look at because it's an area that will distinguish a well-made ebook. It's not always the ebook developer's fault when this is wrong. It should be marked up correctly in the manuscript using styles in Word and in the layout file, and it's frequently not. But the examples on the screen, I hope, are fairly self-evident. That bump is huge. That's emphasis. Voila is a snippet of French, and Titanic is also the name of a boat. And so those are italics for foreign words or proper names. And that's just a style shift. So that should be an I, not an EM tag. And then the last example on the left is I read about ocean-going desserts in Cruise Food, a guide to onboard cuisine, and that's citation for title. So that in that case, it's a cite tag. So use M for emphasis, I for italics, and cite for citations. And then on the right, we have two samples. The first one is bold because it adds no meaning. It's just for a style shift. And the second one, which is the word warning and an exclamation mark, in that case, that should be coded with a strong tag because that's content that needs to be vocally stressed or emphasized. And so using strong is correct there. This might seem Mickey Mouse, maybe it doesn't, but it is often the place where people go wrong. Developers and people who prepare manuscripts and do the production work on it. This is something that should be decided at an editorial level, and it's frequently not. So just something to be aware of. Kay is asking a long question. I was reading somewhere that using B to highlight a certain letter in a word, e.g. to mark the first letters in words that make up an acronym or initialism, National Aeronautics and Space Administration, for example, may cause a reading error for assistive technologies. Is this true? Is there a better way to do it or not to do it? So that's a really good question, and I don't know the answer to that, Kay. You always ask hard questions. Um, really good question. I think that Leah is on this call and she may know. Uh, it's okay. I like your hard questions. They make me think harder about how we do these things. Leah's already typing, so I think she's going to be able to help with that. So let's watch for what comes from her. Leah is smart, very smart, smarter than me. So she'll have a good answer there, I'm quite sure. I'm going to talk about drop caps for a second. The only way to style drop caps is not to have drop caps. Okay, fine. I understand that it's a standard book design way to denote the start of a chapter. I don't like drop caps. I don't know if you can tell. But the question around drop caps is how to style them without interfering with how a screen reader will read the first word. So a lot of times drop caps are styled with a span around the first letter and then some styling on that span. But when you do that, a lot of times that first word gets read in a disconnected way. Like the first letter gets read and then the rest of the word gets read. And so that word is broken apart and not read correctly. So I've seen the word the read with a T and then a gap and then he. That's the word how the word the is read when the T is styled with a span to get a drop cap. So the best way to accomplish drop caps is a little complex and it's using pseudo elements. The key is to hide how the drop cap is created in the CSS without span markup that would get in the way of the first word being voiced correctly. It's a little bit tricky to work this out and it doesn't display as reliably as other methods, but if you're prioritizing accessibility, that's the way to go. So Leah has responded to Kay's question. And she's saying that it's super screen reader dependent and even further dependent on how the individual user set their preferences. So short answer, yes, it can cause an issue, but there's no way to guarantee either way. So I hope that's helped with the question about drop caps or the question about bold for the first letter, especially in initialism. Other notes, avoid all caps. They aren't always screamy, but they might be. So alt caps, when get read by assistive technology, it causes a confusing user experience. Uppercase characters should always come from CSS declarations like text transform uppercase, not from keyboarded all caps. And all caps are particularly awful in the ebooks navigation. Please avoid them. I got some books back from an external vendor this week and they left the all caps in the navigation. So I've definitely asked for them to fix that. All caps should always come from CSS. And in a navigation, so in the toc.xhtml or the nav situation, that's not always possible, but avoid them as much as possible. So you can't use CSS to create uppercase in the nav, but nonetheless, they should be avoided. The next thing is that an index is a navigation and it should be wrapped in a nav tag, not a section tag with the appropriate ARIA role. This gets missed all the time. And so that's something to be aware of. And then I'm not going to go into accessibility metadata a lot in this workshop, and that's partly because there's a third webinar next week in which Amanda Lee will fill us in. But I do want to talk about the accessibility summary, which is frequently not well done. So the accessibility summary, the standard practice is Stephanie's, sorry, I'm going to pause. Stephanie's asking a question about indexes in ebooks. And yeah, I think indexes are extremely useful in ebooks. And I advocate for maintaining them wherever possible. They are absolutely useful. And the question is whether or not they're hyperlinked. And if you are worrying about an index and whether or not you should include it in an ebook because it's flat in, say, the InDesign file or the source file, then I strongly recommend a script called Live Index. It's from a developer called Ariel. Oh, shucks, I'm not going to remember his last name. He actually had a sale on earlier this week. It's over now, but He has this really excellent script called Live Index. I think if you Google InDesign Extras and Live Index, you'll find it. It's absolutely exceptional. Lauren in the chat is saying that script is an absolute game changer. It is a really good script. It doesn't work perfectly. So what it does is it hyperlinks all your index numbers to the start of the print page. So it doesn't hyperlink to where that phrase or word is mentioned. It hyperlinks to the start of the page where it's mentioned. So it's not perfect, but it's better than not including the index, and it's better than including a flat index that's not hyperlinked. um, Live Index, yeah, not Life Index or Light Index, Live Index. Uh, I will find us. I'll find the link. Maybe somebody can do that and pop a link in the chat. But it's an exceptional script. I use it all the time, and not just on indexes. It works on flat table of contents. It works on intra text references as well, although it doesn't create a backlink. But I use it quite frequently. It's exceptional, and I strongly recommend it. I think it's at present it's $69 US to buy it. I've actually, oh, thank you, Lauren. There's the link. I've actually bought it like 3 times in the last 5 years because I keep switching machines and losing my license. But I don't mind because I feel like that scripter really needs to be rewarded for creating such a great script. So I strongly recommend that. Okay, now I want to go back to the accessibility summary. Accessibility summaries are often really verbose and often really repetitive. So avoid using the summary to state things that have already been said in the metadata. And I imagine that Amanda's going to repeat this next week, but I wanted to slip this in here because it's a little bit of a pet peeve of mine. Use the summary to point out where the pitfalls are or anything unique about this particular book. So the accessibility summary should include things like additional information on any hazards that are present in the book. Or it should point to things like sort of unique things about the file and how it's treated. Like, for example, how multiple links to a figure or footnote get handled for backlinking. So, for example, no backlink is provided, or the backlink is provided to the first occurrence only, or only the first occurrence is linked and backlinked and other references are not linked, that sort of thing. Or you could use it for the instance of a cover image that doesn't meet color contrast requirements, and where you need to explain that the cover image is not compliant with color contrast requirements. And this is why this EPUB is only conformant to WCAG A and not AA, for example. So, and Elizabeth showed us how to do that in the last workshop last week. There's a group at the W3C working on complete documentation about this very thing, about the accessibility summaries. And it will be available in a month or two, I think. So there will be really clear, explicit guidelines about how to do all of accessibility metadata and about specifically about how to do the accessibility summary. We are also in the middle of an accessibility metadata research project at eBound, for which there will be a set of best practices in the first quarter of next year. So Amanda Lee and I are working on that together, and that will come out by March 31st of 2024. So watch for that. And then my last note here is if you don't know the answer, then ask. And the community hub on apln.ca is an exceptional place to do that. The community hub on APLN is there for you. Post a question there and get good answers. The hub is as good and as useful as we all make it. So the more people that use it, the more useful it is. And there's a link to the hub in the chat. Thanks, Saiba. And I want to just point out here before we go to questions that there's the checklist on APLN is downloadable. There's the checklist is quite long, so there's a lot of scrolling to get to the downloadable part, but it's right at the bottom and downloaded. It is a really good checklist. Leah from Nell, I told you was really smart. I promise it's true. She created this checklist and it's great. And then finally, here are some resources that I want to point out to you. I will not stop, Leah, sorry. There's a color contrast analyzer that's like a standalone app that you can use to check content in your book. It's really good to use for covers, for example. And there's a link to the DAISY knowledge base. If you're creating page lists from InDesign, I have a script on my blog at that link. So it's laurabrady.ca/blog/building a page list with hyphens in between building a page list. There are some LinkedIn learning videos that are created that you can go look at, including one about how to create accessible EPUB from InDesign, but that one is out of date and you should go to the APLN instead, where there's a more up-to-date version of that content in an InDesign to EPUB course on the APLN. And then finally, in order to keep up with changes in this field and with how things are vibrant in EPUB land, things change all the time. Like advice about how to construct an accessibility summary is always ongoing and changing. And the very best way to stay on top of that is by subscribing to the APLN newsletter. It's a very good place to both get really good Schitt's Creek GIFs and also to get advice about what's changing and any new things that we've published on the APLN and that sort of thing. So go there and sign up for that. And then finally, here's my email address. You are quite welcome to take note of that and to send me email. I am always happy to help if I can. And you know, my approach to accessibility in digital publishing is that a rising tide lifts all boats. And I am a freelance consultant, and ideally I get paid for my time. But the truth is that I give away stuff all the time, and I'm quite happy to give away things to you. So please feel free to take advantage of that email. If I can help, I will. And also my website is right there. So if you have questions, please feel free to put them in the chat or to unmute yourself and to ask them. I'm really happy to answer them if I can. And if I can't, I'll tag Leah. So that's it for today. Anyone brave enough to unmute themselves and ask a question? Or is there anything that I've missed and that you'd like to talk about?
Hello, Laura, Ted from the Netherlands. Thank you for your presentation. I'm very happy to hear about it. One of the things is that with especially the backlist titles, we see that there is already a lot of things fixed. We also digitize a lot of old paper books, and basically a lot of the layout is already there. And often if you want to do things like having a hierarchy in levels, you have to do all kind of, well, tricks to get basically the same thing as what it's different when you start from scratch, then you can apply certain things. Do you have any tips on that? Because basically you see all kind of things. So can we skip something? If we cannot skip some, do we have to do tricks?
Yeah, this is a really good question. And I'm actually just remediating some backlist books, and I'm remediating them from ebook. My personal preference is to go back to the source file and fix it and re-export, but that's not always possible because sometimes the source file are cork files. Yuck. We don't want to talk about that. That's a swear word. The one thing that I've noticed is that generally, if the heading levels are poorly done, they're generally poorly done in a consistent way. And it's easy to then use regex to search for those things to fix them. So P class equals H1 is easy to fix into an H1 by using regex. Now, regex, what I mean by regex is regular expressions for those of you who have never heard that before. And it's a way to use wildcards and it's basically a very fancy find and replace. But that's the tool that I leverage the most when I'm fixing up backlist books from ebooks. I'm sure you have some familiarity with that, Ted. Also, it's very nice to have you here from the Netherlands. Welcome. But you know, generally things are done fairly consistently or in a predictable way, and it's easy enough to regex them to fix the HTML. I don't know if that answers your question or if that helps.
Partly. One of the things we also find that sometimes you see that if you look visually, levels are skipped, or level or something starts with an H2 and And then the question is, what do I do? Do I have to move an invisible H1 before it, or should I do some things with the different classes? Or, well, I have no clue. Ferdinand, who's also on the call, is actually doing the real work. but I'm very curious about how this should be fixed.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I think it's actually as with making a page list where none exists, it's really tedious. And I think that you just have to live with that and sort of, put on some really good music and just power through it. It's not necessarily fun. I like to put on music that makes me angry when I'm cleaning up these old files, sort of like cleaning your house. Feeling angry makes it go faster or feels more personally satisfying, but that may not work for everybody. I
Thanks.
hope that, yeah, you're welcome. Okay, there's a question from Bruce. Do you think using DL, DT, DD in a glossary is preferable over using an LI? You can't keep them all in the same line if you use DT, DD, so I tend to use LI. It's a good question. And it's actually not one that I've encountered a ton, Bruce, so I don't have a ton of experience with glossaries in books. So I don't know the answer to that. Maybe others who have worked on this, I bet you Kay has an answer to this or has an opinion on it, and perhaps Leah. I welcome anyone else weighing in on this question. Also, I'm going to stop sharing my screen so I can see people when they ask questions, if that's okay with everyone. If anyone has an opinion about the DT, DL, DT, DD question over LI, I would be happy to hear it. I'm sorry not to be helpful. I don't know everything. I'm really sorry to disappoint you. Are there any other questions or comments or thoughts? Kay is weighed in. She's always used DL, etc. I don't have strong opinions, although I'm in Laura's boat. This hasn't been a huge focus for me so far. Good to know. Yeah, okay. We have 5 minutes. Let's not waste it.
Hi.
Hiya.
Can you say a little bit more about bringing, when you have all these old backlist list books that you want to fix up, about going back to the InDesign files and re-exporting it? I mean, I guess you did go into the changes from InDesign, but you think that's actually faster than like going into Sigil and making an EPUB 3 and just going through all the errors?
It depends on the quality of the HTML. It depends a little bit on the quality of the ebook and how many errors there are. Sometimes I just get exasperated with how much work it is in the code and I go back to InDesign. So it really does depend. I know that's not much of an answer, but it depends on how much work it will be. Sometimes I just figure out how much work it would be to fix up the InDesign file, which is likely also an unholy mess, right? And or to go to the HTML and fix that. So it's a balancing act.
And I guess if you're going to do the page numbers, it might be back to InDesign.
Absolutely. If you need to put in page numbers, then I would almost certainly go back to InDesign, because putting them in by hand is you just want to poke your eyes out.
But you're doing
so
it.
boring.
You didn't have an InDesign file?
I didn't have an InDesign file. No. Yeah. It happens. I had a Quark file. Remember that swear word, Quark Express? These are deep backlist titles.
Thanks.
You're welcome.
Maybe
any other questions?
I can ask a question about InDesign. I work a lot with InDesign. That's fantastic, but it's frustrating too. With EPUB, what do you know about InDesign? Are they working? They are working not so hard, I think, but are they getting to it to make it better? Because a lot of things you have to do in Oxygen to fix all the problems. Do you know about a schedule or something Adobe works on it?
Yes, a really good question. They have all of the things they need to fix. It's on some of their things, they put 2 things on their roadmap for this year, 3 things on their roadmap for next year. There's 33 things. So they're not chipping away at this very fast. And it is problematic. There's no question about it. They don't necessarily understand HTML very well. In one of my very first meetings with the team at InDesign, the product owner asked me why I didn't just create PDF instead of EPUB. And after I picked myself up off the floor, I said, well, you can't sell PDF. And then he was like, oh, okay, that makes sense. I mean, you can sell PDF off your own website, but you can't sell it on Apple Books or Google Play or Kobo or Amazon, etc. And we explained the European Accessibility Act to them in detail and at length. I think they understand the urgency. That doesn't mean that it's impacting how fast they work. It's a complex team. And I definitely do not want to make excuses for them, but this is where we're at. It's a problem. I had hoped that we would have a way to create page lists automatically from InDesign by this point in the year, and they're not even working on it so far as I understand. So it's an ongoing concern. The Federation of European Publishers sent another letter to them on Monday of this week, which got their attention. So I hope things will change. But I've been stubbornly hopeful for a few years now, and I don't have much to show for it. So
it's a shame.
That's the bad news. Yeah, it is.
And it's the same, I think, with Kobo, for example, a big e-reader company, Kobo. They also are not so hardworking on making things better, because some of the CSS styles doesn't work on Kobo readers, and they don't seem to be interested in it. Is my experience. Do you know about that? Because it's shocking, actually.
I do know a little bit about that. Kobo is another big organization, like very big company, a little bit unwieldy. And fixing something on Kobo is really complex because you have to fix it on for e-ink devices, for screen readers, or for e-readers, on the iOS app, on the Android app, on the desktop app, on the web browser. Like, there are a number of iterations of Kobo. It is really complex. I know the accessibility lead at Kobo, and I know that she's working hard and that she is also frustrated. So things are happening there. They are trying to chip away at the problems. They are aware of what's happening. And they are working on it. It's really complex when you have to make a rendering engine that accommodates change across all of those different reading systems, essentially. Essentially, they have 5 reading systems, not 1. And so any fix has to be implemented in 5 different code bases. I make it sound like I know what I'm talking about. I've never worked at Kobo, so I don't know for sure. But from what I understand, that's the main problem. Yeah.
But for example, I'm talking about just a thing like small caps in the CSS. That's a thing. It exists for 15 years already, and is an international agreement, you can say, and that doesn't work on. Yeah, it's quite shocking that simple things like that are working. But okay, you can you can do nothing about it, of course.
I can't do anything about it, but I can.
But we have to deal with that.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, you're welcome.
Okay, I think we've reached time. Thank you everyone for joining this webinar. We'll be sending a follow-up link with the recording. Thank you so much, Laura, for this wonderful session. Thanks everyone.